Welcome. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'd like to thank you for joining today's ADHD experts presentation titled How Emotional Dysregulation and ADHD Transform Teen Relationships from Messes to Minefields. Emotional regulation is central to daily functioning and well-being. But teens with ADHD are twice as likely as their neurotypical peers to struggle with emotional dysregulation. In fact, emotional dysregulation is known to decrease quality of life for teens with ADHD more than ADHD symptoms alone, a troubling finding in the midst of a teen mental health crisis exacerbated by the pandemic. As teens with ADHD navigate adolescence, from friendships and budding relationships to changing hormones and even appropriate social media use, they need tools to help manage myriad emotional demands, especially in light of today's disorienting and unprecedented anxieties. In today's webinar, we will get a better understanding of emotional dysregulation, its relationship to ADHD, and what caregivers can do to help improve coping skills in teens. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Ellen B. Littman. Dr. Littman is a clinical psychologist licensed in New York State. She has been involved in the field of attentional disorders for more than 30 years. Dr. Littman focuses on a high IQ adult and adolescent ADHD population. She specializes in identifying and treating complex presentations of ADHD that may be misinterpreted or overlooked. Dr. Littman is co-author of the book Understanding Girls with ADHD, now in its updated second edition and translated into several languages. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Littman, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive around an hour after the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 398 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of today's webinar is Accentrate 110. Accentrate 110 is a dietary supplement formulated to address nutritional deficiencies known to be associated with ADHD. It contains omega-3 fatty acids in phospholipid form, the form already in the brain. This brain-ready nutrition helps manage inattention, lack of focus, emotional dysregulation, and hyperactivity without drug-like side effects. Learn more at phoenixhealthscience.com. That's FENIX healthscience.com. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Littman. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading this really important discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about bringing this information to people. And I'm on. So you know that I'm going to be speaking about emotional dysregulation, ADHD, teens, relationships. There's some information about all of those things both in the scholarly literature and out in the media. But there's very little that's looking at the intersection of those points. If you're at all familiar with research on things related to ADHD, then you may know that there is healthy debate and controversy in many areas, some newly established and even some foundational to the field. And this is exactly how scientific inquiry is supposed to work. Nonetheless, the studies frequently show inconsistent findings, and there are wide-ranging hypotheses in terms of how to understand what we find. This is also the way that scientific inquiry is supposed to work, but it doesn't give you definitive answers that you can hang your hat on. So just know that I put together the information that is available out there, and in a year from now, we could find out, you know, it's just the opposite. But right now, this is what we know. And I also want to say that because I've been in this field a long time, back with the dinosaurs, we used to call it ADD. And when I am passionately involved in expressing these things, I may resort to saying ADD instead of ADHD. I just want to make clear that those are the same disorder. ADD is not ADHD, but without hyperactivity. It's just, we used to call both hyperactive and inattentive ADD, and now we call it ADHD. But I may go back and forth, and I'll do my best, but you'll know that that change is not meaningful. Okay, and now I am ready to roll. And I'm going, okay, and there is my first slide. So first I want to talk about the neurobiology of emotional regulation in neurotypical brains. And it's supposed to work so beautifully in that brains intend to maintain emotional equilibrium. And if you're not being controlled by your emotions, then you can pursue your goals. And that's how many neurotypical brains work, that they can sort of power through things that may feel emotional, but they can push it aside, and they can continue to sustain attention to do the things that they want to do. And to maintain that emotional equilibrium, many parts of the brain are involved, but the two main parts are the limbic system, which is led to some extent by the amygdala, and that is in charge of emotional and behavioral responses. And that is the oldest part of the brain. It is absolutely, the first part that develops. So it is a very almost primitive emotional response system. And it's not modulated, it's just responding. And then to counterbalance it, you have the prefrontal cortex, and that is in charge of cognitive control to try to modulate those emotions. And as the executive functions start kicking in, they use those abilities as well to modulate emotion. Now, here's the sort of sneaky part, which is that the prefrontal cortex, where you work on having the best possible judgment, that is the last part of the brain to develop. And so what we have is this amazing abyss between the emotional part that is functioning in the beginning with no modulation until cognitive control can sort of jump in there. And there can be a really long period of time where the prefrontal cortex is fully developing. And as research goes on, we find that those abilities are not completely available until the brain, the front prefrontal cortex of the brain is fully myelinized, which is the nerves being coded in a way so that connections can flow freely. And we keep sort of edging up towards the larger numbers in terms of when is that finally matured. And we used to think 21, 23, 25. Now we're somewhere in the late 20s for a neurotypical brain. And for a neurotypical brain, as you mature and all of those executive functions sort of work together, the ability to modulate emotions continues to improve. However, okay, how am I going to get to the next one? Oh, there you go. Okay, hang in there while I figure this out. And this one is, okay. Oh, it was all lit up. Okay. But here's what happens when you have emotional dysregulation and how it affects an ADD brain. So we know that there is a developmental delay in terms of how the ADHD brain develops and matures. And, usually we think of it as maybe, 2 years, 3 years behind peers. Maybe when emotional equilibrium or lack of such is involved, maybe even 4 years. So that's an important thing to keep in mind that, in other words, the teens do not have all of those executive functions available to them. While they are developing, they are not yet choreographed so that you can effortlessly have them work together for the goals that you want to pursue. So what happens with emotional dysregulation is that it makes it very difficult to maintain emotional equilibrium because it increases how excited the brain gets in the face of emotion. And probably you've all witnessed a mood going from starting to feel it, and then it is escalated to 1,000% in the blink of an eye. And so you can't really intervene when that happens. Then balancing positive and negative emotions. The reality is that the brain is responding to the intensity of the emotions and how stimulating they are. And if they're intense, they will increase dopamine, whether positive or negative. But it's balancing positive and negative is just going to sort of give a slant one way or another to the mood. And unfortunately, often in the world of ADHD plus emotional dysregulation, it tends towards negative moods. But they can feel overwhelmed by anger, sadness, and even hilarity. I mean, it just feels a little bit out of control to them and you. And so it's about inhibiting the responses, and that has to do also with a certain amount of impatience and impulsivity. In order to inhibit responses, you have to have a moment to say, whoa, that's too much. Let me tone that down. And that is very difficult to do in the face of emotional dysregulation. And then the other thing is about once it gets up to that 1,000%, how do you get back to the baseline? And one of the ways that emotional dysregulation is measured is how quickly it escalates, and also how quickly it returns to baseline. And in some cases, it takes a really long time, and it gets caught in a sort of inflexible sort of investment in that extreme emotion. And that's where we can get in a lot of trouble. And for teens, teens are also dealing with the fact that they're dealing with puberty and raging hormones, and they are more emotional in general. And then for girls who are just experiencing estrogen in their systems, they have a monthly exacerbation of ADHD symptoms when their estrogen is low. And you just add that to the picture of what they're dealing with. And on top of that, their bodies are maturing physically and sexually, and they're experiencing sensations that they've never experienced, and they're trying to manage them. And those things are things that can't really be explained. I mean, that words will not help them know what to do when they experience these feelings. So I think it's fair to say that they're going to be overwhelmed by that experience as well. In addition, they're moving into high school, where there are more academic demands, demands that increase in complexity. They're given projects that are that may long-term projects that they will have to somehow balance over a period of time, which is something they probably are not familiar with. And it is also in the face of decreasing parental scaffolding, I mean, which has been something that has created routine for them and made life more predictable. But when kids get to high school in general, that is an appropriate way for parents to sort of back away slowly and give their children more independence to handle things. And again, that is probably more the case in neurotypical brains. And I think that ADHD teens probably need more support for longer than you would think if you were just reading about a neurotypical brain. So those are all things to take into account in terms of what the teens are trying to manage. And the goal is really so that they can manage their emotions rather than their emotions dictating to them what their behavior should be. And that is the tightrope that they walk with ADHD and emotional dysregulation. Okay, and I'm working on getting to the next one. And there it is. Okay, so what does it look like when there's emotional dysregulation in teens with ADHD? So as we were discussing, in the neurotypical brains, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex work together to create a balance. But in the world of ADHD, those two parts of the brain actually are competing for dominance. And basically, you want the cortex to win in this competition because that helps the judgment and inhibition and give more control over the emotional life. But actually, the limbic system and the amygdala are very powerful. And so emotional impulsivity, which is typical of ADHD, and I think probably everyone is familiar with low frustration tolerance and quick to anger, irritable, excitable, defensive. Those are things that most people see at some point with all those with ADHD. And emotional dysregulation increases the intensity and the unpredictability. So it is more chaotic. there's outbursts, there's refusals to cooperate, verbal aggression, physical aggression, mood volatility, swearing, shutting down. So they are unable to really consistently inhibit their responses. And so things may appear or are socially inappropriate. And this disturbs parents on many levels. And it's important to remember that they are not choosing to be inappropriate, even if that may be embarrassing to them and to you. But it is an out of control experience for them. And when they are in the throes of that, they can be misunderstood, especially when with hormones also raging at the same moment. So they may be misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder, reactive attachment disorder, borderline personality, because all of those involve impulsive responses that are hard to inhibit. And there are other possibilities too, but the point is that it's a important differential diagnosis that not everyone will know how to make. And other ways that it can express itself is even in terms of responding to the emotions, whether it's ranging from disordered impulsive eating to try to calm themselves with carbohydrates, which will increase serotonin, or substance use, whether it is tobacco, which increases focus for some, or to just tone down the intensity, whether it's going to be alcohol or drugs. They're trying to manage what's going on in their brains. And when it feels very out of control, there can also be self-harm thoughts, because they can be impulsive in responding to what might be a negative input from somewhere in their environment. And the other thing that we find in addition to self-harm is also high-risk sexual behaviors, which are also impulse-based. And in the absence of being able to think first, those behaviors can get people in a lot of trouble, and we'll talk more about that. But in general, either they're choosing relationships that may be high stimulation, which often can be interpreted as high conflict. And if they're not, the emotional dysregulation will take those relationships and take the messy part and make it into a minefield. So it's even harder to negotiate. Okay. So what are the social consequences for these teens? Find out. So pretty much, I think there is consensus that teens with ADHD have poorer social skills and poorer communication skills than their peers. They are generally less responsive, especially to parents, more avoidant of dealing with difficult things, can be more hostile if you want them to stop doing something that they want to do, and they are more compromised in being able to manage their own feelings, especially if there is a comorbid oppositional defiant disorder or a conduct disorder, which is one of the things that I think when people have emotional dysregulation in mind, that may be what they're picturing. And while that is certainly a major component of emotional dysregulation. There are many other looks to it that we'll talk about as well. And the expectations for separating and individuating at this age, are pretty normal. This is about when, in terms of the neurotypical world, kids are getting more independence and more let me decide for myself. And no different with these ADHD teens. Unfortunately, they may not possess the necessary skills to handle that yet. And that is a very hard thing to try to sell to them because they will not be able to see that. And of course, everyone wants to protect them from disaster. But on the other hand, it's very hard to, it's another tightrope of how much independence can you give without them falling into a black hole. And they often perceive criticism or rejection, and that can provoke verbal expressions of frustration and even physical expressions. And we're finding out that actually peer rejection is more triggering when emotional dysregulation is present than either the impact of hyperactivity and impulsivity, which we have in general thought as the things that can derail relationships. But peer rejection is huge for this particular group. And the emotional dysregulation also increases the risk of internalizing problems, including, depression, rejection, sensitivity, withdrawal, anxiety, shame, somatic complaints like body, complaints about feeling nauseous. And so there are a lot of ways in which they are struggling, and at the same time, the out of controlness chips away at their self-esteem even more. They have a low sense of self-worth, and they feel demoralized. And there's some learned helplessness, which is that they keep trying to manage their emotions and they continue to fail. And at some point, they may just feel like, I just don't know how to do this, but I give up really trying. So all of those internalizing problems can become comorbid, coexisting problems in addition to ADHD and emotional dysregulation. So we want to really keep an eye on minimizing that as much as we can. And let's see, next. Okay, is romantic relationships. So this is an issue that is obviously very important because a lot of the patterns that they sort of figure out right now that they feel work for them can persist into adulthood without treatment. And some of them are not as helpful as we would like them to be. So we want to intervene when we see them doing problematic things. In general, we're finding that the ADHD teens that have the more severe symptoms are much less satisfied with their relationships than those that have just simply ADHD with lower severity symptoms. So we know that the teens with emotional dysregulation are experiencing relationships that are not satisfying, that they have rated themselves as poor quality, and they have less emotional intimacy and just generally less satisfied. And what we find is that these teens report that they have double the romantic partners, the number in terms of compared to their peers. And they may overestimate that, and they may misread friendships as being romantic relationships, or they may be also counting romantic interests, even if it is not yet or is not going to be a mutual relationship. So it's hard to measure a lot of these things, and that's one of the reasons that they haven't been studied as much, because these are very hard concepts to measure. Every one of these things exists on a continuum. It's not yes or no. It's how much of this happens. And it is very hard to, find a way to operationalize those ideas with numbers. So we're talking about trends, really. And so the trend is that in addition to having more romantic partners, generally the relationships are shorter. They start dating earlier. They have intercourse earlier. They have more casual sex, and they very much report having more unprotected sex. But interestingly, in terms of their relationships, they don't report more aggression than their peers' relationships, and that's certainly good news. Many teens, especially early teens, tend to sort of go with a gaggle of friends, and that those are sort of the initial friends moving into romantic relationships. That they're involved in group experiences. And this is one of the areas that these teens are different, where neurotypical teens, at 86%, they're saying, report that most of their interactions with their romantic interest peers would be in a group situation. It's only 12% with our group here. So that's a very big difference, and it may have to do with the fact that they have fewer friends in general. They may not have a large group of friends. Girls particularly have been shown to be more dependent on a romantic partner for support than friends, because they have fewer friends and fewer friends with whom they share emotional intimacy. And there's a greater likelihood of them developing this negative conflict resolution style. And so in the face of out of control emotions, first they may just try withdrawing if they don't have a way of inhibiting their responses. Then they'll try just complying with what they think is expected of them. But neither of those things really work. And then ultimately, it sort of explodes into a conflict engagement. And so it's basically, trying to hide and pretend for as long as they can. But then once it gets to the conflict level, they don't have a lot of skills to deal with that. And it's understandable that then there's greatly diminished satisfaction, while they experience or describe some satisfaction when they're complying. But obviously, compliance is not being their authentic selves, and we want them to be their authentic selves. So it's pretty complicated to navigate all of those issues. Next, in what way does emotional dysregulation affect the relationship with social media? So obviously the pandemic has had a major impact on this, and this is sort of a moment in time where they have been deprived of relationships for a couple of years in person. And as a result, social media has become a central force in most teen relationships. And in general, that has been helpful for many. I mean, it's a way of maintaining connection with their peers, and especially teens who feel vulnerable and are impulsive and distractible, and prone to compulsive behavior, really have come to over-rely on these online relationships as basically their source of peers interaction. And, they've moved on from Facebook to Instagram and Finstagram, the fake Instagram, and to Snapchat with the disappearing images, and TikTok. So those are all so new that there is really very little, research that's been done yet. We're still looking at things like Facebook and YouTube. But I can say that the influencers on YouTube, who are young teens themselves in most cases, are especially girls are drawn to them as a source of validation and status, in that they share certain views with these people, and therefore that must in some way say something about them. And so we do find that in general, females are more addicted to the social affiliation in terms of Facebook, Snapchat, and also constant texting, and even online shopping. Whereas, we do find that boys are more involved with video gaming, cyber pornography, online gambling, but they also can be, equally interested in Instagram, and TikTok is for everyone. And they can get involved in a way that they can't really see that things will change in the future. I mean, that what's being reflected back to them from social media is very much what they start internalizing as their identities. So they can become really depressed and despairing if their responses from social media are more shaming than supportive. Okay, and next, okay, and then what happens when they are over-relying on the online relationships, and it really becomes addictive. And I think that is something that at least I hear in my practice all the time, that is something that is scary to people. And the way that we assess addiction, again, there is no absolute clarity to this, but it's about how severe the addiction is assessed by how much time do they spend doing this, and what is their emotional response. I mean, do they feel more included, or do they feel more rejected? And what is the intensity of the involvement in terms of how obsessed are they with doing that, and difficulty disengaging or refusing to disengage? And to what extent does it create withdrawal from their real-time peers, and from their families, and from other interests, and from their responsibilities and their academics? And then also the fact that they can easily be drawn into situations where there could be sexual manipulation, financial manipulation. There are just all sorts of sites, and that these teens are so desperate for a sense of belonging and a sense of being accepted and understood that they may not be paying attention to the fine details that could get them in trouble. And so that it's really about what the literature is calling salience, which is how preoccupied they are with their social media in terms of using it to modify their moods or change their emotional states. And it's being used as a tool for that reason. So, rather than trying to sort of figure things out themselves, they will basically use social media as a way of seeing if they can feel better. Unfortunately, it increases their exposure to cyberbullying, to being recruited into all sorts of political campaigns, threats from trolls as scams. There's all sorts of things that they don't see it coming. There's a lot of possible ambushes out there, and that true addiction really involves them to the extent that they are at risk for academic failure, social withdrawal, all sorts of behavioral problems, and tremendous family conflict. And one of my focuses here is on the family conflict, because all of these situations really are temporary in their lives, because the good news is that development continues and maturing continues. But the pain between parents and children is something that just people hold on to. It's very hard to forget how painful it is. And we don't want to have people pushing each other away. But it's a struggle for everybody. So let's see the last slide. Oh, and I have to talk really fast, but I'm okay. So here's some of the things that you can do to help. And these may not be the same kinds of things that you read. These are not do this instead of this, but this is important that when you're hearing things that feel disrespectful and rude, it triggers things in parents, and it feels like a personal attack. And one of the most important things to know is that this is not personal. It sounds personal, but it's just uncontrolled emotional explosions, and you are the person who is standing there. And if you can depersonalize it, it's easier to see a struggling teen instead of an attacking teen. And what can you do to help with how badly they may be feeling about themselves, which is really that the strengths and weaknesses approach that I like is focusing on the fact that all of these kids have abilities, they have talents, so whether they're artistic, whether it's sports, whether they love to read, whether they have niche knowledge of something interesting, whether they love to help animals, whatever it is, those abilities and passions are important, and they should be able to understand that those things are important, that everyone has strengths, and then everyone also has weaknesses and difficulties, and that everybody finds workarounds for their difficulties. And the way that this can be helpful is that it sort of normalizes their struggles, so that they're not like these out of control people, that everybody is trying to find a way to balance, strengths and then, minimize weaknesses, but know that they're there and deal with them. And it doesn't make them different, because feeling different as a teen is one of the worst things that they can feel. And the other thing that is important is downtime. Downtime is essential for parents and for teens to regroup, especially when things are getting heated. It is, impossible for the teens to shut things down. And it may be hard for parents to shut things down, but it's probably going to fall in your lap to do so. And even if it's done in 2 words of like, we need to both just go chill out, and we can reconvene in an hour and try to talk again. But that there should be some agreement, some mutual agreement that we've stopped talking about this, rather than imposing a punishment, because this isn't misbehavior. This is just a brain that is not able to control itself. And what I would say about that, in my takeaways, is, and I say this to everyone, and this is something that people come back to me 20 years later and say, this is the thing that really makes sense. And this is true of everyone. Development is uneven. In other words, there are kids who at age 2 are verbal, and there are kids who don't really make full sentences until they're 5. There are kids who have incredible coordination and sports skills when they're really young, but they have trouble learning to read until they're in 2nd and 3rd grade. It's uneven. They can't be developing everything at the same time, and it is always an unknown what aspects are going to develop first. But you can be sure that it will be uneven. And in order to really move ahead, everything has to sort of work together in a choreographed way. And so many, or most parents of teens with ADHD, and especially with ED as well, are feeling like, oh, they'll never be able to do this. They can't do this, and it won't all come together. And believe it or not, it comes together, and you just have to wait it out. And even though it at the moment, everyone just rolls their eyes, ultimately, if you wait it out and you remember that the developmental delay is that they are socially and emotionally behind their peers, maybe by 3 or 4 years in development, then you know that those things have to catch up. And so expecting more from them when they haven't developed those skills is really not fair. And punishing them because they can't do what their peers can do is also unfair, because they can't. It's not that they won't, but they can't. The other issue is about most parents experience the fact that there's a tug of war between them and their teens. I told them what to do, they did something else. But the reality is that a lot of teens are saying, oh, okay, I should do that. But then their brains actually say, that's boring, I'm not going to do that. Or their brains are too hyper aroused with emotion, and they can't even consider, unloading the dishwasher or doing their homework. And it is really helpful for parents and teens to understand that the struggle is between the teen and their brain. And it actually makes the teen no longer like the bad guy in between. And they understand that it's a negotiation where they will learn how to work with their brains, but that sometimes their goals are not going to be supported by their brains because their brains are looking for high stimulation and more dopamine, and usually doing homework is not the route for that. And finally, the idea of articulating compassion. And this is a difficult situation. ADHD is hard. Being a teen is hard. Relationships are hard. And then adding emotional dysregulation just makes this, I mean, really unwieldy. And so you and your teen are grappling with something that is really incomprehensible. And it's really scary when things are incomprehensible. And just the idea of expressing that you're both on the same team of dealing with something incomprehensible, and assuring them that you'll somehow get through it together. I mean, without saying that you know the answers and they don't, it's just we're in this together, is something really, really comforting to teens who are always assuming that they've done something wrong and at any moment they can be rejected for it. It's very much about the fact that we can't ask, now that you understand more about how the prefrontal cortex develops, you know that you can't really expect a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old to be showing good judgment all the time. I mean, it's actually not even possible because their brains haven't fully developed in that way. And if you just remember this in terms of maturation, then you'll remember that this is something that you just have to wait out. And the best thing that you can do is ask them to explain what's happening, but then understand that you can't really punish them for being honest about all of their impulses and what they've been trying to do to manage them. That it just all has to be done in that context of, I know you're struggling, and that single-handedly will be one of the kindest things that you can do for both of you. And I think we have one more slide in that, as I explained, really the idea of ADHD, emotional dysregulation, teens and relationships, there's very little information out there on that. The information that is out there is primarily produced by ADDitude magazine. And so that is great that we have them. And so these articles are things that touch on different aspects of this, not on all of it, but different aspects. So according to what you most need to know, these will possibly give you some more direction. So I thank you for your attention to this, and I'd be happy to answer questions in the time we have.
Wonderful. Dr. Littman, thank you so much. Before I launch into the Q&A, a quick thank you to Accentrate 110 as our sponsor of this webinar. One of the most prevalent questions we've received today is a lot of parents saying, this information, knowledge is power. They feel like they better understand the root causes. How can they get their teens to listen to this information and to engage in a conversation with them about what's going on with their own emotional dysregulation, so that they feel, perhaps less alone, more empowered? A lot of parents reporting that their teens just will not engage in conversation with them.
Right. So you will be pretty shocked that this is going to be my answer. TikTok is going to be my answer. And believe it or not, yes, they certainly have no interest in hearing what their parents have to say, but they do have interest in hearing what peers have to say. And there are quite a handful of resources on TikTok where there are people who are giving evidence-based information in the way that ADHD teen brains need to hear it. I'm trying to remember the name of How to ADHD. That's one of the sites that that discusses these things, that you can go through and find what is of interest to them. And it can be between them and these videos that are on YouTube. There are a number of different sites that will address this. Now, obviously, this is something that you want to check out first, but there are some lists out there of reliable sites. But believe it or not, that is one of the ways that they will get information. And in fact, during the pandemic, it was so helpful to people that so many more teens and people in their 20s got information and actually came and said, I think this is what's going on with me, that there were more diagnoses of young people because they were getting the information themselves rather than their parents trying to sort of cram it down their throats, which just never works. So that's my suggestion.
Wonderful. And we will add it to the resources for this webinar. ADDitude, we did publish a feature on TikTok about a year ago that has some of the more reputable and helpful TikTok content creators there. The other big question that we're getting from parents is it's helpful to understand the brain chemistry, certainly, but when their child really is exhibiting negative behavior, they're struggling with enforcing consequences that will communicate that the behavior is not acceptable, swearing at them, punching a wall, being disrespectful to adults or other family members. What advice can you offer for parents who are struggling with enforcing consequences for these behaviors?
And I think that is certainly the question that has been around since the beginning of ADD, which is forever, is how to manage that. And I think probably all parents know that there isn't a consequence that can make an impulsive brain stop and say, oh, wait, let me consider whether or not I would like that. And as a result, most of the suggestions of different ways of providing consequences aren't really effective. I mean, what you can do is you can acknowledge that their behavior is that they are feeling out of control, and that it's not that you're not angry at them for having that experience, but you also don't want to be abused by that experience. And so the best thing that you can do is remove yourself from the situation, because even if you ask them to remove themselves, they're probably not going to do so. So you have to remove yourself by saying, even though I know that right now things are out of control, I still don't want to be spoken to that way. But as soon as you're feeling more in control, please come back and find me, because I want to talk to you about it. So it's, and that is but all parts of that sentence have to be there, because you have to communicate that the line is not about them changing how they're experiencing their emotions, because you can't and they can't. But what you can say is, here's the line of how I will allow you to treat me. But I am not rejecting you. I'm only, setting a limit on overt behaviors. And I know that when you calm down, you're my wonderful child, and we will attempt to talk about this. And so really, it's the opposite of labeling them in a negative way. What you're doing is you're reminding them that you know that in there is the child you adore, and that you understand this is out of control, but there is no single kind of consequence that can make their brains stop responding to what they're responding to. And that's a really important piece of information.
That's a really great way to wrap up today's conversation. Just reminding them and yourself that they are deep down in there the child that you love and adore. So unfortunately, we have run out of time for today. But thank you so much, Dr. Littman, for leading this really important conversation. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. We do host free weekly webinars with ADDitude, and next week we're doing one that may be applicable to some in this audience. It is specifically for moms with ADHD, learning to care for you so you can care for your child. And so we hope you can join us for that. And I also want to mention that subscribers of ADDitude magazine should keep their eye out. They're going to be receiving the summer issue very soon. And in it, we have some great content about inattentive type ADHD, as well as perfectionism and ADHD in menopause, all topics that don't get a lot of coverage. And we're really proud of that work. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Littman. It's always an honor to have you, and we hope to see you again here soon.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope it's been helpful to people.